One of the most exciting developments in travel today is the potential for Cuba to draw more American travelers. This year alone, 36% more Americans traveled to Cuba than in 2014. But what does that mean? Well, we certainly can't get on a plane and go just yet. But there's more to this story, and we've got Beth Harpaz from the Associated Press with us, and we've also got some senior members of MMGY Global here to contextualize her comments. Stay tuned for another edition of Brands That Travel. One of the most exciting destinations to open up recently is Cuba, and here to tell us more about what the recent developments in diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Cuba mean for the travel industry is the travel editor for the Associated Press, Beth Harpaz. Beth, thank you for joining us.
Hi, nice to be here.
Beth, there's so much excitement and enthusiasm for Cuba right now. Can you tell us why?
It's been cut off from the average person for so long, and yet relations between America and Cuba are, they're really very deep. Our history is, it's a century old. There's so many cultural connections. You go to Havana, there's so many American things there, not just Hemingway, there's baseball history, there's all kinds of cultural ties, such a big Cuban community here in the United States. And, combined with sort of the mystery, the thing that we can't have, what's it really like there? I think all of those things combine to make it a place that people just can't hear enough about right now.
There's so much information, so much excitement about Cuba right now. Is the media properly informing travelers about what they can and can't do when it comes to travel to Cuba? So really, can any of us just get on a plane and go to Cuba right now?
Not legally. General tourism for Americans is still banned by federal law. The embargo remains in effect. There are permitted categories of travel. Journalists can go, family members can go. You can go for certain types of activities such as educational, the arts. The reality is that it's a little bit of an honor system right now, at least from what I can tell. You do have to fill out paperwork. You can't just go on Expedia and book a flight. You have to go through a charter company. The flights are very expensive. And you do have to fill out a piece of paper that, says you are going under one of these categories of travel. And of course, there are thousands and thousands of Americans who are going to Cuba by a third country. So they're flying to Cancun and they're getting on a flight to Cuba and they're not getting their passports stamped. Again, that's strictly not legal, but it does seem that under this administration, they are not enforcing those regulations very heavily.
You reported a couple of months ago in May that there has been a 30% increase in U.S. travelers to Cuba. Now, are those travelers going on the legitimate forms of travel, or are those folks that are doing the third country trips?
Those statistics came from the Cuban government, and they included all categories of Americans entering Cuba. So they were just counting every American who, flew into Havana, with a U.S. passport. I mean, 30% is a huge increase. It was in a 4-month period, and that increase was, absolutely driven by the opening of relations, on the part of the Obama administration.
So Beth, that's actually, for those of us who wouldn't have the luxury of getting to sit down with you, a travel editor for one of the nation's largest news organizations, and asking them, give us the real story on what it's like to travel to Cuba, what do I need to know?
I would love to mention 3 things in particular that travelers really need to know when they go to Cuba. One thing is, if you need something, bring it with you, because there really are not a lot of stores in Havana. I mean, you can buy a Che Guevara t-shirt, but you can't buy a toothbrush. So that's number one. There's not a lot of consumer goods there. If you need it, bring it with you. Number 2 is, if you're old enough to remember travel before Wi-Fi, before ATMs, then you need to go back to the future to go to Cuba. And if you're not old enough, then you need to learn how to do that. None of my credit card companies would authorize me to use them in Cuba. In theory, you can do it if it's a non-American bank, but in practice, most businesses don't accept credit cards there. It's an offline culture. It's a non-digital culture. It's a culture that's a cash culture. And the third thing is just this concept of an offline culture. We've become so used to just, I don't know where it is, I'll Google it. I don't know how to get there. I'll use my GPS. My reservations are on my phone. Okay, none of that is going to work in Cuba. There's no signal. You can't get your phone to work in Cuba. And, you can show somebody the reservations on your phone, but actually if you don't have a piece of paper, they don't care. I mean, I literally encountered Americans who had paid for and reserved things, stateside, and when they got there, because they didn't have the printed out reservations, that wasn't good enough to show them like an email that they had archived.
Let me recap that then. The three things that if you're traveling to Cuba, you must know the following. Number one, bring anything and everything that you will need with you. Number two, it is a cash society. Bring money with you because the ATMs will not work. There is no ATM over there. And number three, it's back to the future. In other words, we are off the grid when we are in Cuba. So print everything, those maps, those reservations. Those are three awesome tips, Beth. I wanted to ask you, who stands to profit from the opening of doors in Cuba, pun intended, and what are folks like Airbnb doing? Is that really a good way to see Cuba and experience authentic local Cuban culture?
Well, of course, the Cuban economy is controlled by the government there. I think it remains to be seen how much the Cuban government is going to let multinational corporations come in and open businesses and what those terms are going to be. What I've heard is that the Cuban government doesn't really want tourism in Cuba to look like Cancun. They don't want it to be college students coming in on spring break to get drunk and, snowbirds coming in to escape the cold by staying in a very inexpensive all-inclusive resort. What that's going to look like in terms of, travel companies coming in and opening entities, I think that's a big, big question mark, and it may be a long time into the future before we really know that. On the other hand, Airbnb is, it's not a Marriott, it's not a Starbucks, they're not opening buildings there. They're connecting with Cubans in the sharing economy model. They have, I think, several thousand listings now. There are not a lot of reviews yet because most of those properties haven't been stayed in. I did love where I stayed for its authenticity, but I will tell you that it was very gritty. It was a very working class rundown building. The lady who ran the casa was lovely. She was like a Cuban grandma. She made me a beautiful breakfast every day. My apartment was clean, but it was not a 4-star hotel. Even the 4-star hotels in Cuba are not like the 4-star hotels here. The level of service is not up to United States standards, even in the finest hotels.
Beth, with all the challenges that represent travel to Cuba notwithstanding, are other Caribbean islands, is Mexico, are these destinations on notice, or can they still expect to continue to attract American travelers who might not be ready for that kind of adventure just yet?
I mean, I think Cuba's a very, very different experience. I actually didn't go to the beach, but the infrastructure in Cuba it's quite decrepit, quite frankly. I mean, the government has not invested much. Even in Havana, you're driving down the street and there's just like a big hole in the street. So I don't think that this is going to be Turks and Caicos tomorrow, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely a place to go if you're a little bit adventurous, and the authenticity factor is certainly there. If you need air conditioning and seat belts and Wi-Fi, then maybe you should be going to Turks and Caicos.
Understood. Beth, thank you so much for speaking with us. This has been such an exciting conversation. Lots of great information here.
Gracias.
I'm joined by my colleagues here from MMGY Global, Chris Davidson, our EVP of Global Strategy, and Katie Briscoe, our Vice President of Client Relations. Hi, guys.
Hello there.
All right, so let's talk about Cuba. It's not like we can just get on a plane and go. And once you do get there, it's back to the future. No cell phones, no credit cards, nothing. Bring cash and an adventurous spirit, I guess. So who's down for that kind of adventure, Chris?
This is a traveler who's passionate about travel, loves to explore new places, see new things, experience new adventures. It's really not a matter of how old you are. Millennials are no more likely to want to go than the boomers. It's really not income dependent. So an affluent traveler or a less affluent traveler is no more likely to travel than anyone else. So.
This adventurous traveler, it doesn't really seem like there's anybody else in the Caribbean that can pretty much offer that kind of experience. So is Cuba competing, let's say, with a Jamaica, a Puerto Rico? Who's in their competitive set?
That's a great question, because I think when we typically market for our Caribbean destination clients, you really look at their core target market within the geolocation. But as Chris just described, it's a really unique target audience to Cuba. It's not folks that are looking to lounge on the beach per se. They're looking to have a truly unique, one-of-a-kind experience.
Should Cuba start thinking about how we're going to market ourselves to the U.S.? Is that something that they can take on their own, or are there other ways that they can start to better educate American travelers about what they have to offer as a destination?
You know, in terms of the things that they should be doing up front is making sure that they're building on their infrastructure, or at least planning for that infrastructure once they have the funding to be able to do that, to host tourists and meet some of the expectations of the U.S. traveler. Also, making sure they have a strong and powerful brand message to tell that they can tell consistently. And then I think very importantly, working to train local service providers for tourism in Cuba so that they're able to then receive that U.S. visitor appropriately.
I think you have a situation in Cuba where there is an incredible amount of opportunity, but it's really going to be an uphill climb. Trips that are solely based around leisure are still illegal. I mean, it's still not allowed. There has to be another purpose for the trip that is within the parameters that our government allows. I think Beth hit on it nicely. There are certainly ways around that, and it's not strictly enforced, but I think the way that you position that to the market has to be really well thought out, because the confidence that you give to a consumer traveling to a destination like Cuba, where there's still some uncertainty and some, I think, probably misconceptions about the destination, it's incredibly important that we come at an angle that's not embracing, hey, by the way, this is the law, but let's bypass it, but more so, how do you tie in a lot of this cultural education and some of the unique attributes that make Cuba a truly one-of-a-kind destination?
It's not like Cuba needs to go out with a huge advertising blitz to try to drive a tremendous amount of new tourism to the destination. Really, it's about making sure they're true to themselves, because that's what the visitor from the U.S. is interested in today.
One of the things that I think is most exciting about this story is that there's really no other tourism story like this U.S. to Cuba travel story. But Kate, in your experience with destination marketing, is there any other parallel, any other story of a destination that suddenly opened itself up that we can learn from it?
Tourism isn't new to this destination. It's new to the North American traveler, which when I think of it from the perspective of our agency, where we have such a deep understanding of the American traveler, it's especially important because it's a unique target that we would be approaching. I find it so interesting because as you listen to what Beth explained, how you truly have to unplug, and a lot of our research suggests, and certainly something that I can rally behind, is that unplugging is something we all aspire to during leisure travel, especially those of us with busy lives. Slowing down and taking a deep breath and having a truly once-in-a-lifetime experience is what we aspire to on our leisure travel. But unplugging is something we want to make the conscious choice to do. If you're embracing this destination for your leisure travel, you're going to unplug. You have to, and it requires a lot of planning. And so what I find really interesting, and certainly as we explore what really is this market and how do we position it, is how do we sell this what has become a very non-traditional method of booking travel. But as we look at our target market, and then it's not just limited to millennials, which is, as Chris dug into the research, I was really surprised by that. It's the adventure seeker across our age groups that we typically target. So you have folks that aren't necessarily as dependent for their entire travel experience, from research to planning, to booking, to actually sharing that experience as we would normally see with some other target destinations. So the key thing for Cuba is to really find and partner with some smart marketers that really understand the American traveler, and then how to really uniquely position Cuba in that space, which is increasingly competitive.
Do we think there would be a willingness from the Marriotts of the world, other airlines, to partner with the Cuban government to bring travelers down there?
I think there's certainly going to be opportunities as relationships normalize a bit between the two countries, but it's hard to know which direction that'll go at this point from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think this short-term planning for how to attract the American consumer is really important, because the future is extremely uncertain. With a change in administration, these parameters could change quite quickly, or they could expand quite quickly. I would say, like any relationship, there's going to be trust built over time, and I think as people become educated about what is truly allowed in terms of travel to Cuba. But I think in this scenario, we're taking baby steps to sort of open tourism to Cuba, and in some ways that seems frustrating, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it's really a blessing in disguise, because there is a lot of preparation that needs to be done with the infrastructure to really welcome the North American tourist and meet that demand over the long term.
Yeah,
I see it really as an organic growth over time. I mean, you think about how they could potentially work to attract the U.S. audience within the current constraints to some extent, is creating, through the Ministry of Tourism, they're potentially even creating local tourism, local guides, to help you experience the local culture, and whether that's things like cigar rolling and some of the more traditional kind of immediate connotations you might have with Cuba, but there's a rich cultural heritage in Cuba. And thinking through the different pieces of that, that content could be pretty rich, and adding the credibility of the Ministry of Tourism facilitating those local guides is certainly a good entree for a U.S. audience to get comfortable with the idea, but to really experience the true richness of the destination in an authentic way as well.
I think the American traveler that would go there, that's taking the step to research it, because you do have to navigate some unconventional channels to plan a trip there, I think their expectations would be less probably on the service side. They're probably not looking for a luxe experience, but they're looking for that great social media moment. Do you think that that's something then that makes Cuba less of a threat to other Caribbean destinations, right?
So, we looked at those interested in visiting Cuba, and we took, we looked at their entire profile, and we compared that then to those who are interested in the Caribbean but not interested in Cuba. And they're very different audience. And so the traveler to Cuba is much more focused on that heritage, that cultural experience, again, experiencing new places, meeting new people, seeing new things. And the Caribbean traveler is much more about the beach experience.
These are people that tend to be a little bit more go with the flow and really seeking that adventure that allows them to really share a really powerful travel experience with their personal networks.
Yeah, we talk a lot about, okay, Americans are coming, and it's almost talked about as if it's a bad thing for Cuba. But we know that the rest of the world has been there. Why do you think that there's that perception that somehow Americans, us being able to go there now, might change things up in a negative way? Like, what do we think about that? Why do we think that's the case?
Well, I think it's sheer numbers and proximity. I mean, you're considering the proximity of the United States to the Cuban shores, and you've got the sheer number of active U.S. travelers is staggering compared to the rest of the world in many respects, certainly on a country-by-country basis. But I think it's recognizing a lot of these major corporations, the Starbucks and McDonald's and so forth of the world, they're based in the U.S.-based company. So there's a lot of tremendous pressure for those companies to keep growing, to keep their stock price rising, and Cuba is certainly a good
prime target
market.
For sure. Let's talk about Airbnb. Personally, I think that what they're doing is so great. They're towing that line between authenticity, but at the same time making it so easy for anybody really to just log on and start to envision a trip for themselves. How do you think they're doing with that? What do you think of that approach?
I think Airbnb's ability to penetrate that audience or that market so quickly, based on some changes that have just happened in the last 8 months, is terribly impressive, and I think goes to show the impact and the reach that shared economy is going to have in the future of tourism.
What are you excited to see out of Cuba, and what that means specifically for the travel marketing industry?
Well, I'm just interested to see how they balance the potential opportunity of opening to the U.S. market with the what I believe is an important need to maintain the cultural richness that they have as part of the experience.
I think as a travel marketer, it's a really interesting challenge and opportunity, and seeing how the next few years unfold and what long-term, what we're talking about in a decade, what it's meant for the economy and the people of Cuba. I think it's very exciting. Through our research, we know that more people than ever want to have a truly unique travel experience. I'm a firm believer in the fact that life is all about experiences. So the fact that we're opening a destination that hasn't been experienced by a very specific generation of people, opening that up, I think is extremely exciting.
There's clearly a lot of enthusiasm and excitement for Cuba as a destination for leisure travel. I want to thank our experts for joining us today and shedding their insights on this exciting topic. We're certainly going to keep an eye on these developments with Cuba, and we look forward to seeing you on another edition.